Good evening. Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, I've made some available on the small table by the entrance. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. Public humanities programs at the library are made possible in part due to support from generous community members and from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which contributed to the library's own humanities endowment and established its Public Humanities Initiative. So it's my honor tonight to introduce our guests. First, Lorraine Atkin, not just a longtime student of history, law, and politics, but also a former leader in the criminal justice and political fields. She is the author of Mightier Than the Sword, How Three Obscure Treaties Sanctioned the Enslavement of Millions and the Exploitation of Continents for More Than 400 Years, the book about which we are here to learn tonight. Mightier Than the Sword asks, how can words on paper be more devastating than war? Why is there persistent inequality, racial, financial, structural? Why are things in our society the way they are? Its argument offers a perspective on the roots of the inequality of today by drawing upon documents written hundreds of years ago, which embody the biases and power strategies of their time, but that still have a long reach through history up to the present. Atkin examines three treaties, the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Treaties of Nanking, and the Conference of Berlin, each of which granted permission or sanctioned rationale to decree that annihilation and confiscation of property was legal and just on 5 continents. Atkin argues these written words continued to achieve their objectives and exercise their power by influencing, among other things, the codification of Eurocentric International Law. Enhancing trade was and remains the claimed intent, but inequality serves this objective. Land dispossession, slavery, and the subjugation of indigenous peoples are repeated themes in history and remain with us today. This book changes how readers understand today's events, and the continuing influence of historic documents is revealed, offering a fresh perspective and hope for real change in policy and the societies they shape. Lorraine is joined tonight in conversation by Stan Katz, lecturer with rank of Professor of Public and International Affairs and Director of the Center for Arts and Cultural Policy Studies at Princeton University. He was formerly the class of 1921 bicentennial professor of the history of American law and liberty at Princeton University. He is a specialist on American legal and constitutional history and on philanthropy and nonprofit institutions. He is the president emeritus of the American Council of Learned Societies, the most significant national humanities organization in the United States. His recent research focuses upon developments in American philanthropy, the relationship of civil society and constitutionalism to democracy, and the relationship of the United States to the international human rights regime. He is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford International Encyclopedia of Legal History and the editor emeritus of the Oliver Wendell Holmes Devise History of the United States Supreme Court. His writing about higher education policy has appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education blog, and he is the co-founder and editor of the History of Philanthropy blog, www.histphil.org. He received the annual Fellows Award from Phi Beta Kappa in 2010 and the National Humanities Medal in 2011. I'm grateful that Lorraine and Stan are able to join us this evening, so let's thank them for coming to the library. So at this point, I'll invite Lorraine up to the podium to make some remarks, and then she'll join Stan in conversation. So thank you again, Lorraine.
Thank you very much. I'm surprised that people came out in the rain. I saw the rain, I thought, 3 people would be nice. Well, thank you again. The phrase, "the pen is mightier than the sword," was expressed by playwright Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1839, indicating that the written word is more effective than violence as a means of social and political change. The quote is perfect for the title of this book that focuses on treaties, sometimes charters, or words on paper, and even a concept. How can words of a treaty be more effective than violence or battles? Treaties are less expensive, quicker, written and signed, enduring, and can be more devastating because millions can die from their pronouncements. These three treaties, with these three treaties, 5 European countries crafted the permission slip to destroy millions of people with their cultures and profit from the taking. What they were doing was then legal and just. The countries, usually referred to as the great powers, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and Germany, were not enemies drafting a treaty to end a dispute. They were allies with a common purpose of settling rules they needed amongst themselves. Therefore, they lasted as long as everyone played by the rules. The treaties allowed them to control continents with indigenous people, Black people, or Native Americans who had societies and cultures of their own, had no place even at the negotiating table. Battles win territory, but a treaty can rule the world. Why are these three treaties different and unique? For one, they fit neatly into a time period from 400 years, from 1500 to World War I. They trace the steps of exploration, exploitation, colonialism, empire building, and imperialism. Their scope, as I said, it takes 5 continents. Importantly, they needed no standing armies in these territories, no fighting amongst themselves. It was their basic purpose. They fated people to become a commodity, to be bought and sold. Their duration, they bequeathed a legacy of a surreptitious caste system that lasts until today, and there was no court of appeals for those wronged. Though this book is a very serious book, it's not hundreds of pages of a tutorial on treaties. It is a narrative that draws you in with many interesting characters, including kings, queens, doctors, chiefs, presidents, explorers, bandits, drug dealers, and even a pirate. Greed bars no one. Trade was the most important business of the time, with mercantilism, explorers going to the kings and queens for money with the promise of a percentage of the profits for the return of the plunder, and perhaps they'd get a medal. Therefore, our story begins in 1492 with a navigational accident and ends up as an incredible real estate windfall that split the entire world, as it was known at that time, between Spain and Portugal. Spain with North and South America, and Brazil with the eastern coast of Africa went to Portugal. This division was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade for these seafaring countries. It was also why the official language of Brazil is Portuguese. The papal bulls or directives of Pope Nicholas V and Pope Alexander VI were merged into the Treaties of Tordesillas. There was no other decision-making authority for trade transactions. Therefore, it was considered the first international treaty that led to Eurocentric International Law. That's where Stan comes in. Pope Nicholas had directed King Alfonso V to capture, vanquish, and subdue the pagans and other enemies of Christ, to put them in perpetual slavery and take all their possessions and property. Remarkably, a clause was usually inserted into these treaties to require missionaries on their expeditions. It could then be called a civilizing mission. And God and the law were on the side of the conquerors. The other European countries were not to be ruled by the dictates of the Pope. Hence, they utilized what they called the doctrine of a discovery as their instrument of annexation. This was a concept. It was nothing written down. There were no people at a negotiating table. It may have been derived from a Roman concept of terra nullius, free space, regardless if people were living there. The doctrine was just as effective. As an example of the force of this concept, the British took the entire continent of Australia with Tasmania and New Zealand. Thomas Jefferson, through our own Articles of Confederation in 1777, abolished the sovereignty of Native Americans with the doctrine. Thereafter, Native Americans could never retain nation status, and John Marshall used the doctrine in subsequent Supreme Court cases. The hideous example of words on paper of black codes after our Reconstruction demonstrate that blacks, regardless of legislation, who had been taken from other parts of the world, were still not free. From mercantilism, we moved to capitalism with the evolution of shareholders founding companies such as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, and other countries followed suit. The hundreds of years the British attempting to trade with the Chinese are greatly condensed in this book, but nevertheless extraordinarily interesting. China had been a closed country, and the Chinese wanted it that way. Eventually, the British succeeded in creating what I call a triangle of dependency between India and China and themselves. The British wanted to trade their products with the Chinese. The Chinese were not interested in wool and other products the British had to offer, and the British desperately wanted their tea. From about 1526, the Mughals had ruled approximately 2/3 of India until the British East India Company had been given control of India by the British Parliament with a charter, words on paper. The company, which had about 100,000 soldiers in the army eventually through India then, forced the Indians to grow opium rather than their own food crops for the British to trade with China. The Treaties of Nanking came from the Opium Wars. They were not exactly wars, more of a gunboat diplomacy. The treaties and the threat of force enabled the British to legally sell opium taken from India into a country, China, where it was illegal and where the British were totally exempt from Chinese law. Among the dictates of the treaty that are the sources of contention even today was to open the ports and navigation rights to free traders. Hong Kong was given to the British, and more favored nation status was established that trade deals could be given to one were open to all. This in another country, this is what they forced upon the Chinese, resulting in what the Chinese called 100 years of humiliation. And India eventually becomes the jewel in the British crown. By the mid-1880s, the European slave trade ravaged all of Africa, even though Europeans controlled just 10% of the population. And even with the total ban of slavery on the European continent in 1850s, there was no attempt to ban slavery in the colonies. In the 1500s, it was acceptable to believe that the blacks and indigenous peoples were not human or that they were barbarians. Darwinism attempted to legitimize a fictionalized scientific claim of an interior race, and with all the benefits of imperialism, an emboldened temperament of white superiority took hold. Trade was booming, but new markets of slaves and natural resources were necessary. The only place left was Africa. The so-called partition of Africa was already happening. It had become a greedy scramble. Even though Africa had its own nations, many recognized by other countries prior to 1884 as the family of nations with their own treaties, they were now considered as ready for the taking. But then they needed new rules for this game. Enter Otto von Bismarck. Having success with the unification of Germany and looking for his own acquisitions, he decided to play mediator and set the rules for the conquest of Africa. The chapters of the Treaty of the Conference of Berlin were the how-to for the European atrocious land grabs of Africa. First of all the original African treaties were made null and void for the new turn of events to begin with a clean slate. Sections of the 6 important chapters of the pact included that notification of acquisitions and occupations should be made to the other European countries. It didn't matter if they had already taken them, just sometime get a note to us. The treaty guaranteed the freedom of trade on the Niger and Congo River and made use of the surrounding contiguous lands to be for the Europeans. Contiguous, be careful of the word contiguous, it's the gift that keeps on giving. There are those who argue that the conference was not an effective agreement because it was not enforceable. But by the late 1800s, the height of imperialism, the great powers of Europe had accrued enough wealth, power, and military strength from hundreds of years of plunder for people to believe they had the power to do what they wanted. No other nations could compete. Where could the Africans seek relief? There were no court of appeals for them. The only problem could come if the Europeans themselves did not adhere to the rules of engagement. Remember the pastel-colored, not everybody here could remember that, but if you're my age, you remember the pastel-colored maps hanging on the blackboard in front of our grammar school classes? That was the way we saw Africa, with the names of European countries on each country, usually in little brackets. Nonetheless, before the conference, Africa was 80% under indigenous rule, and after the conference, by 1908, the entire continent of Africa was under European rule, with one exception, Ethiopia. Very interesting story, how it's only one country was able to not be taken in. Germany became the third largest colonial power in Africa, and by the end of the 19th century, Europe had added almost 9 million square miles, 1/5 of the land area of the globe, to its overseas colonial possessions. Tens of millions of people had been killed, traded, or survived to work as slave laborers. How can one arrive at numbers? Who in fact counted the slaves? The ship captains loading the boats, traders at the auction blocks, or plantation owners? Were they counting people or commodities? Did they count children? Did they count women? Data is an abstraction. Africans were never counted as human beings during this upheaval of humanity. Each kingdom has its own horror story. The Conference of Berlin is just one vital chapter of the devolution. Moreover, the battle against racial injustice continues. The concept is not just a lingering emotion. It digs in and spreads like a malignancy. Justice is not always a cure. Okay, stand. We'll sit with Stan.
I wanted to be sure I turned on this thing. Okay, thank you, Lorraine. So that's the book, and it's a wonderful book, and I urge you to read it. And I'm going to carry on with a theme that was a subordinate theme, what Lorraine said, but I think is central to understanding the problem that she's talking about. But I'll begin with an offhand comment that we haven't discussed, which is I think that President Trump is now trying to prove that Lorraine is wrong. And that's an interesting problem, which maybe we can come back to in the discussion. That is to say, and that's what I do want to talk about now. Why is it that anybody pays any attention to international law? That's not such an easy question to answer. There's a great deal of scholarship, very fancy scholarship about all of this. And I would say the jury is still out on that question. And the reason is that ordinarily law is obeyed because it can be enforced. And there's a reason why you usually don't run your car through a red light or across a street if the light tells you not to do it. You know, there may not be effective enforcement of just that, but you're likely to do it. We're habituated to do it. But what drives that habituation is the ultimate knowledge that violations of norms can actually be punished. And the reason for that is that in the ordinary national situation, and we'll talk about that later, it is the government that is, say, it is the sovereign, it is the unit that has the ultimate responsibility for the allocation and enforcement of power that is behind law. So the rule of law depends normally upon effective sovereignty in any particular place. And that, in short, is the problem of international law. International law is a system of law, but no sovereign, because there is no international sovereign. We have in the last century, in the 20th century, had two experiments with creating some sort of international sovereignty, the League of Nations following World War I, and the United Nations, which of course still exists following World War II. But for instance, if you follow the negotiations that have been going on, or you choose the period of time, but let's say in the Middle East or somewhere else, and you ask yourself the question, where was the UN? The answer is probably nowhere. And the reason is, given the way the system works, it was never intended to be an international sovereign, and it's not an effective international sovereign. So in fact, international law, this is to oversimplify it, really is that law which is created by international treaties. So in other words, it is agreements among nations to establish norms, and then it's frankly more the hope that those norms will be obeyed than anything else, because there is no sovereign ordinarily to enforce them. Sometimes treaties create enforcement mechanisms so that the parties to the treaty will take responsibility for enforcing it, and that can be quite effective. But as a general rule, that isn't the case. And the best example there, I think, would be what followed World War II, the creation of the United Nations, and the most important treaty ever passed by the UN is the International Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. It's a magnificent document, which of course doesn't apply to the United States because we're not a signatory to that treaty. And that is the problem with all international treaties. They are binding, at least in theory, only on those nations that subscribe to them. And even with some of the most important, I'll give you one other example, and that would be the Treaty of Rome, which is 1998, which was the treaty that established the International Criminal Court. Most of the nations in the world signed on to it, but not the United States. And indeed, we originally affixed our signature under Bill Clinton. We signed that treaty, but it was never ratified by the Senate. And treaties in this country are unenforceable in this country unless they are ratified by the Senate of the United States. So Clinton signed it. Bush unsigned it. George W. Bush removed our signature from it. And so we are not party to the Treaty of Rome. And even then, the Treaty of Rome gives member nations, participating nations, easy outs. I don't want to discuss that further right now. But it's an enormously important concept. And if most of the people in this room, like me, are too old to have studied the International Declaration in school, at least I didn't, and maybe you did. But if now they do, or if you go to Europe, for instance, or most other parts of the world, children know the International Declaration. Since it's not American law, we don't study it. And by the way, the reason one of the reasons we didn't sign, and I think the reason why most Americans don't pay much attention, is we assume that our constitutional order is better in any case. That's wrong, but I'm not going to try to explain that right now. if you want to understand that, you can come to the course that Phil Karchman and I are going to give in the full. But it's a really important concept. And I just really want to stress this, the point of enforcement. So back to Lorraine's book, the theory of this book, the argument of this book, is that words on paper mean something. And in the period she talks about it in general, I think that is correct. But it's something of a mystery why that should be. And I think the real question for people who worry about this sort of thing is, what is the relationship between those words on paper and the international power of the nations signatory to the various treaties? Is it the case that nations generally obey treaties if the signatory nations don't have some coercive power over them? In theory, they should. In reality, I think it's not so simple. Although, as Lorraine argues, this did usher in an era of peace and peace among nations. But there are a lot of theories about why that should have been. And even recently, after all, the period after World War II is thought by scholars to be the longest era of peace in recent history. And that's true if what you mean is there was no major international war. And the reason for that, the practical reason for that, was that the dynamics of the Cold War prevented, and the threat of nuclear annihilation made nations quite unwilling to wage real war, large-scale war against one another. But what we had was, 50 years of proxy wars. So we fought in Africa and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world that really were part of the Cold War, but they weren't Russia going against the United States. You may think that's progress. I'm not so sure. We could talk about that later. But I think that's the underlying problem, and which I would like you to think about. And now I'll turn it back to Lorraine.
I think after I finish this, and I get, in the book, I get to, as I say, World War I.
Right.
When these 400 years, which I say were unique because these were not rivals. They may have been rivals, but they were not enemies, people who signed them. They wanted them to work. There is an interesting incident that's outlined in the book about Fashoda. This showed that things were falling apart, that people weren't adhering to the rules of the game, and then it wouldn't work. Fashoda was a little slave, I guess, encampment just south of Egypt. And the French and the British, by this time, were building up a rivalry and angst over the Suez Canal. And then they decided that this little spot would be helpful to them. And so the British had about 100,000 men coming across the whole continent of Africa, and French had maybe about 1/10 of that amount of people coming down the other. And they met at Fashoda. And everybody in Europe was concerned that this might be a battle, which they did not want. So it became a stalemate. But what it showed was the rules were no longer holding. And this also gets us to a change in what was happening all across the world, and why only those 400 years could this have worked.
Right.
Because now you had the addition of the United States and Russia as leading powers, changed the whole complexion of who was going to be boss here. We also, though, got on the topic of nationalism, right, which really interests me for perhaps the next topic. And why was this happening? Because after right around the time of the World War I, imperialism, as I say, was falling apart. The Europeans could not, without slavery and without the resources, without free help and free products, it was not working too well. So imperialism itself fell apart, but the countries took on the prestige and exceptionalism as their strong points. By this time, each country did feel they were exceptional. They had everything they could possibly want, and they wanted the prestige. So I wondered, though, then how come that Germany and Italy were different than England and France? And my limited knowledge, and I'm going to need you for this, I mean, obviously, to have nationalism, you do have to have a sovereign. Well, Germany and Italy at the time had just had the heady feeling of the unification of both of those countries. So therefore, they had a strong leader. So nationalism, it seemed patriotism was stronger there than places that still maybe were ruled by a sovereign or were breaking up into different types of democracy or not. So there was a different feeling about that. Can you help me with understanding, is there some truth to that? And the thing, too, that once you have nationalism, you have to have authoritarianism. And the thing about nationalism that separated it perhaps from exceptionalism was the military strength. When you see the country developing their military so strong, and that being prestige, exceptionalism, nationalism, patriotism, watch out, it becomes authoritarianism. Yeah. So watch out for any military parades. That seems my last thought on that, but I do need help with this.
Okay, well, let me give a very quick, it's going to take a long time to answer all of the questions you put. The first thing to say is that, of course, what's most distinctive about Italy and Germany, it's interesting you choose those two, is that they're new nations. Mm-hmm. And they are 19th century nations. They consolidate various political entities that had previously existed, but it's only really in the last quarter of the 19th century that they achieved both the boundaries and the political form of modern nations. And I think that's enormously important. So, and it meant that in the 19th century, or even in up to World War I, they didn't have yet the strong nationalism that some older nations did, because after all, the idea of nationalism is essentially a 16th century idea, and it changes a lot over the next couple of hundred years. But it's a different form of nationalism, which we don't have time to talk about now, in Italy and Germany, I would say. And of course, there's so many things to say, but what happens in Germany, of course, in a different way in Italy, really, is that under Bismarck, you get political consolidation. That's enormously important. And ultimately, it gets perverted into the authoritarianism of the 1930s and during the Nazi period there. But history could have turned out differently. And you also get Mussolini, right. You get authoritarianism in Italy too. I would say neither of those things is inevitable. And it would take us much longer to ask why it is that nationalism went wrong in these two countries. And, if you worry about the United States, then you would want to know, right. Do we run the risk now of nationalism going wrong in this country? The only thing I'd say about that now, and we can talk about it later, is I certainly don't think that's inevitable. And I think I could give you all kinds of examples in history where nationalism doesn't lead in that direction at all. So I think these things are always historically contextual. It depends a lot on other kinds of conditions. But I'll go back and say one other thing earlier. Part of this that's crucial, I think, is the economic basis for political organization and for the exercise of power. And the way nationalism worked in the 18th and early 19th century was on the basis of a theory. And it was a theory of mercantilism. You mentioned that. and that's really important because Donald Trump is a mercantilist. He doesn't seem to know that, but he is. Because the mercantilist theory is that power is economic, that economic power comes from trade, and that power is allocated and measured by the distribution of capital. So in the 18th century, what that meant was that to be strong, a country had to command the capacity to accumulate specie, to accumulate hard money, hard wealth, really. And the idea was also that the distribution of wealth in the world was fixed, and that therefore the allocation of power was a zero-sum game. That is to say that anything I gain, you lose. That should sound familiar to you. Mr. Trump believes that. When he talks about China and the trade imbalance, I think somewhere back there, that's the idea he actually has. It's a perfectly respectable idea. I would have thought that it went out in the 19th century, but apparently not. It's a really important concept. And so concepts like that, I think, are what you also have to look at. I think the treaties are enormously important. But I guess the neo-Marxist in me would say that there's always a material basis for international relations. Okay.
Thank you. You had another question that I probably don't know the answer to.
No, I can't remember what the other question was.
That's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I say I'm thinking along the lines of the period in between World War I and World War II, and I can't help but get stuck on treaties because those are the words that are written down. So,
Sure.
I get a couple of books and one says one thing, one says the other, but the treaties are there. And so I'm looking at that period of time, and the Middle East was taken apart through treaties.
Right.
And so that leads me to like about 4 or 5 other treaties that I'm considering, and oil being the basis of that, but how the Middle East was divided up, and by one treaty a secret treaty that didn't work out, but it was
Sure.
the preview of what was to come.
No, that's right. And famously, until recently, the political structure of the Middle East was determined by the settlements made by European powers after World War I, and that's what Lorraine is. I remembered what it was. I was going to say, I think talking about nationalism is tricky, partly because it means different things
Right.
at different times, but there are different kinds of nationalism, and particularly the term is being used a lot now in this country. So I think it's important to distinguish between what I guess I would call international nationalism, that is, France versus Spain, Portugal versus the United Kingdom, that sort of thing. And the nationalism that really refers to the internal structure and dynamic of a single nation. So when we talk about nationalism in the United States, for Mr. Trump, it means America first. But for other people, it means a pride in what they take, whatever it is they take to be American. And that's a form of nationalism that can be, it's always very powerful. It can be positive in the sense
Patriotism, in a sense, yes.
it's patriotism. But if you do it in the wrong way or you take it too far, it can be very destructive after all. The sins, just take this country, committed in the name of patriotism and nationalism in this country, it's a long list, I would say. So finding a way to express domestically, to express nationalism is extremely tricky. And I think the best example of that in recent years was what happened in Charlottesville a few years ago. I think we had there the conflict of groups of people who had very different notions of what it meant to be a patriot. And, Mr. Trump's reaction to that was that there are good people on both sides. That's not very helpful. And neither side at that time thought that. I felt keenly about that because one of my Woodrow Wilson School students here was the mayor of Charlottesville at the time, and he's a PhD in political science and a lawyer, and I think he understood all of this very well. But it was very difficult to manage that, and particularly since a lot of the people on one side had come in from outside Charlottesville, so it wasn't a sense of the community taking care of itself. So it's an enormously, nationalism, I think, is an enormously important concept, but it means so many different things, and it has so many different expressions.
I'm just wondering if, which comes first? I mean, if you have authoritarianism, then had been patriotism is now called nationalism.
Sometimes.
And,
Not always.
and can we have nationalism without it being an authoritarian government?
Well, again, we should probably stop on this, but I would just say that I would be more cautious in using the term authoritarianism.
I'm not going to use it at all now.
Well, no, you have. So, but I think it's a tricky term. And I mean, to people my age, it means Germany and Italy in the 1930s and 1940s. And that was really not so much, I would say, authoritarianism as totalitarianism. That's a stronger concept and had much uglier outcomes, as we all know. Now, there certainly is authoritarianism right now around the world. And so if you look at the trend towards strong executive government and weak democratic behaviors, you look at the Soviet Union, you look at Turkey, you could think of half a dozen or 10 countries where that is happening right now. And of course, one of the questions is that happening here? Can that happen here? It depends, what you mean by it. I think it's very difficult to say, really, and it's impossible to say, I would say, in the abstract. But I think we ought to open it up to questions at this point.
So if you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. But yeah, we'll welcome that now. Thank you.
She's got one there first.
Thank you. I am wondering if it may be possible to draw a distinction between nationalism that precedes the formation of a nation state, that form of nationalism that once a nation state, and nationalism that grows out of an already existing nation state.
Sure.
I'm thinking of England and really even the United States, kind of growing out of an existing state system. So I'm wondering if that's possible to draw that distinction. And then I also wonder if it's possible to draw a distinction between a kind of soft nationalism that is just sort of like an affirmative identity, like patriotism, or maybe even Yankees fans, all wanting the same thing in the stadium, and nationalism that's attached to a grievance of some kind. And if it is possible to draw that as a legitimate distinction, I'm thinking that the grievance-oriented nationalism is what leads either to war or authoritarianism or what have you.
Good. Lorraine, why don't you address that part of it? The relationship between grievance and nationalism. And certainly there are a lot of grievances
Are you
amongst the
talking-
countries you're talking about.
I say I really wouldn't be able to answer it because it's a question I have too. So I do, that's, to me, I wonder how you cross that line. And that's why I asked which comes first, the authoritarianism, and then you look back and say, wow, there was nationalism there, or, does it grow from there? So I would have to...
Okay, well, let me say a couple of words about it. I don't want to say too much, but one is I think you have to distinguish between nationalism and what I would call self-determination. So what happens after World War I really is that under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, essentially, the primary solution to the reorientation of international relations after the First World War is self-determination. And that was largely an ethnic concept. It meant that the Serbs and other ethnic minorities in the imperial political units that existed in the early 20th century should have the right to be self-determining. And then I think that is part of an answer to your question, because their grievance was that ethnic minorities were being ruled by other kinds of people, and therefore they weren't having the opportunity not just to govern themselves, but fully to express themselves and fully to bring out the latent virtues in whatever group they happen to represent. You know, innumerable examples of this kind of, the biggest one over the longest period of time is Zionism. But you can think of a great many others of that kind. So I think that's the most important example of the sort of thing that you're talking about. But the general point you make is just quite right. That is, that there are many, nationalism means many different things. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of scholarship, mainly earlier in the last century, a little earlier in the last century, by philosophers and political scientists trying to define it. To me, the most important distinction in understanding the world we live in is a different one, though. I would say it's between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And there has been a scholarly debate about that as well. And the nationalists would say in this debate, what's important, and Mr. Trump would agree with this, and a lot of reasonable people would agree with this, what's important is really to look to our own sort of inherent nature and interests and to be true to those. And I would say that there is a kind of affirmative notion of nationalism of that kind. Whereas cosmopolitanism says that what's important is the universal characteristics of human nature, and that what we need to be true to is that. And the best expression of that is probably the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it has, as I say, the problem that that's all and well and good, but once you get a conception like that, how do you put it into play? How do you make it work? We have a better notion of how to make nationalism work, although it too can be perverted. So that, you know, that's a lifetime project, and that's
Yeah,
5
something
minutes
I'm
on
gonna
it.
do.
There was a question here.
I'm interested in why you think treaties ever work at all. It seems in my lifetime and a little knowledge I have, treaties work until, as Lorraine said, they don't. When some person, some dictator, or some group of people decides they want to take over some other territory, they want to drop bombs, they want economic expansion, they do so. What are they bound by? Maybe in the past they were bound by a sovereign you talked about. Maybe the sovereign was God, but God has less of a role today. So why should treaties work? Why did all the nuclear disarmament treaties work for a while until they didn't?
I think the key to any of them working, I mean, I think of a treaty pretty much like an agreement or a contract. And I worked with contracts. If you don't have inequality on both sides, the contract is not going to work. The treaty was not going to work. That's why I say there's a unique period of time in these 400 years. There was an agreement, but it was not with another side. It was with people who wanted it to work. And that's a big difference. But once they started fighting amongst themselves, it didn't work. And you could see it falling apart. I mean, you could see it. When I'm researching and you're looking down at it from reading books. But the reason an agreement or a contract works is that you have to have something good for each person on both sides, or it just does fall apart. But even in the short term, where you're thinking of short term, there are treaties that last and give peace to people for, it could be 100 years, and they're happy with that. It may not last forever. times change, things change, but it is a mechanism to have some peace in a sense if you're thinking of peace treaties.
Did the treaty lead to the peace? Were the peace suggested because of philosophical? The people agreed. When they stopped agreeing, they said, "The hell with the treaty. I want something else."
And it's not a peaceful time and during these 400 years for the people who are on the other side of these treaties. You know, don't forget, this is controlling a 90% of a continent by virtue of those words on the treaty. Why was it working? Because they had no place to argue it. And there were stronger people with guns and stronger, more money, more power. The Treaty of Tordesillas is interesting because it was decided by a pope who supposedly was infallible. So nobody was going to come against the pope. In Nanking, there was gunboat diplomacy used in that against people who had sticks and stones. So that worked, and it worked for a while. Hong Kong, it still belongs to Britain in the sense of it's on its own, if I'm not mistaken, but it certainly isn't back to China yet. So they do, certain parts of them last longer than a lot of people would like it to.
Yeah, I'll add only one thing to that. I think you gave a bad example. I mean, I would argue that in the in the nuclear era, it's worked. I mean, we haven't had a nuclear war. I think that's pretty important. And it was people who understood very well, like Henry Kissinger, who helped to make it work. And his theory, which many people subscribe to, is mutually assured destruction. So if you know that the cost of using a weapon is that you will suffer ruinous harm, probably you're not going to do it. That's why we had these proxy wars I spoke about. We could afford to have these marginal conflicts. We couldn't afford to have the major powers going against one another. We came close. I think the closest we came was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's a place where, in fact, then diplomacy worked, didn't it? Because in the end, the Russians blinked first, but Kennedy also blinked and made a meaningless concession, the removal of missiles in Turkey, and everybody said we've won, and went home. Well, I think that's a great example of the fact that sometimes they work.
I have another example of one that worked. It's in the book, the Treaty of Antarctica, which was drawn up in the 1950s by 15 countries who did not want to have nuclear tests in Antarctica. And they had some other provisions of it, but it is still in place. Maybe not with global warming, because it was easy to have it in place because there's nobody living there, but if global warming, we might be fighting over beachfront property or something.
What happened with the Antarctic Treaty when they found valuable minerals?
That's what
Well,
I
that's
say,
another-
and they would only, the global warming
That's
could
another
change
question.
that, because right now there's nobody living there, but it's lasted so long.
Cliff, is there another? We'd have time for one more if somebody has a question, I think. You're intimidated.
Don't be shy.
Okay, good. You-
Ja-
Oh, here's.
Yep.
Wait, you take the mic.
Thank you, sir. When you first mentioned Trump, you said he was a mercurialist or mercury or something like that.
Mercantilism. Remember you said
He's talking about mercantilism. Well, that's the theory that international power is driven by material resources, whatever they are, in a period of time. In the 18th century, it was silver and gold, and that there's a fixed amount of that in the world, and that country that has the greatest reserves of that has the greatest power. In other words, it was an equivalence between material resources and national power. And what I was suggesting is that Mr. Trump seems to have that kind of mindset, and I think that's what drives this whole tariff battle that we're fighting right now.
Yeah, what's the word again?
Mercantilism.
Never
It's
heard of it.
MERCANTILISM, I think. Is that right?
Close enough.
Yeah. It comes from mercantile. Ever heard of it? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stan.
You're sticking around for a signing, so if you would like to purchase a signed copy of the book, Lorraine will join you right over here on this side of the room. Thank you again for being here tonight.
Thank you.